when you hear that, you need to say got it so we can record this. And it'll be housed on the UT Extension Trousdale County YouTube page at the end of it. But we'll also send it out to everybody. But Taylor works for the UT Extension office in Williamson County. Her degree's in landscape design, and she has a master's in ornamental plants. And she is also a certified arborist. I think I'm right with that, Taylor.
Yep.
Drake also has a degree from Auburn University, again, at least from the good school in Alabama. And he's got a degree in landscape architect, and he works for a landscaping company there in Franklin. I believe I'm right on that.
Yep.
And, they are going to take it over. So there you go, Taylor.
Thank you, Chris. We'll get started. All right. I'm going to go ahead and hide some of these meeting controls so I can see what I'm doing. All right. So tonight we are going to very quickly go through landscape design. And this is a class that normally we would teach 3-4 hour class on. And so to kind of narrow it down, we wanted to pick things that we thought were the most pertinent and most important things to remember when you're talking about landscape design and when you're thinking through designing a landscape, whether it's your own landscape or maybe someone comes to you, they know you're a plant person and they ask you, what should I do? There's so many possibilities with design. It helps to have some framework and some rules and principles to follow to help guide your creativity and guide that design. And I know y'all had Lucas Holman not too long ago talking about right plant, right place. So we aren't going to get nitty gritty details of specific plants necessarily, because one of the first things that I learned in design class was plants come last, which is really hard for a plant nerd like myself who thinks of plants first in almost every situation. But with design, plants really need to be kind of one of the last things we think about. So today we're going to talk about why design, do we need it? Some of the functional principles of design, some of the aesthetic principles, and then the whole design process. How do you go about putting pen or pencil to paper and coming up with that design? So the first question we often get asked is, why should I do a design? Is it even important? Do I need it? And the data would say that yes, actually a design, a well thought out and planned out design for your landscape can increase the value of your property. And when we talk about design, a lot of people think, oh, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of plants I'm going to have to take care of, but designs can be low maintenance. And really, one of the first things when you talk to someone about doing design, or when you think for yourself, you need to ask yourself, how much am I willing to put into this landscape? How much do I want to be out there working in it, working the soil, working the plants? So designs can be low maintenance. They can lower your energy bill. They can mitigate hydrological issues and concerns like drainage, flooding, stormwater issues. I know with the storms that have come through lately, I've seen a lot of landscapes and gotten a lot of pictures from community members with issues of stormwater, flooding, drainage problems, and a well planned out design can really help with some of those issues. And you don't have to do it all at once. If you've got sticker shock or you are just overwhelmed with how much you have to do, how big your property is, you can always do it in phases. Start small. I was out at a site visit today, and there's a homeowner that wants to renovate her turf. And she's got a lot of work ahead of her to get a nice stand of turf grass. And it's just her by herself. She lives alone, and she doesn't have the finances to hire someone to come and do it. So she's doing it herself, and she felt very overwhelmed. And what we told her was, take it a piece at a time. Start in an area that you look at most, that you're concerned about most. Start there and then work your way around to the rest of the yard. And that can make it feel a little less overwhelming. Some data to back this up. When you have a well-done design, a well-done landscape, it can increase the value of your home by at least 15%. And honestly, in today's market, it could be more than that. And so if you look at it kind of with the numbers, a $300,000 home, that can add up to $45,000 in value to your home, whether it's the botanical garden of your dreams, or just, having some good foundation plants, a little bit of pop of color. All of that can go towards increasing the value and the curb appeal of your home. You've probably driven through a neighborhood and looked out your window and, passed a little judgment on what you've seen as you've driven by. And if you could drive by our house right now, we're not going to show you. You would definitely judge us hardcore because from looking at it, you wouldn't think two plant people lived here. But it just takes time. This definitely can just be a process. It doesn't have to all be done at once. What is design? So we talk about why should we design? Well, we're going to get into what actually is design, because there are some things that, it is very open to interpretation, but there are some things that we try to do with each design. And one of those things is design manages the viewer's eye. Whether it's taking the eye somewhere we want it to go, like somewhere good to look at, or maybe it's blocking a view we don't want seen, having a privacy screen. In this picture here, my eye automatically goes to that front door. And with a lot of designs, that's kind of the purpose, is to take your eye to the home, to that front door, to the front of the house. And so with this design, I'm not blocking anything. I've got a clear view. The way that the plants have accentuated the home lets you see the beauty of the home and doesn't block it or confuse it. It adds just enough interest and makes your eye go, maybe it's not necessarily to the front door, or maybe it's to the front door and then secondarily to the water feature there. And this stone path was put in because they wanted a way to get to that front door easily, but to make it more aesthetically pleasing. You've got the stonework, you've got the grass in between there that's going to grow up as it fills in and make it feel a little more creative. You don't just have a slab of concrete, you got some rock in there as well, adding a bit of texture. Maybe it's that you want to create an oasis. So in this picture here, we've got our eye automatically, at least mine does, goes straight to that feature in the middle, that hardscape, that water feature in the middle there. And that's kind of like, that's our focal point. That's where we want our eye to go, and we want our eye to stop there and then take a look at what's around us. So they've done a great job. And all these pictures are one that Drake have done. And so if you've got questions about them, he can definitely answer them. But with this, what he was trying to do is create that focal point, keep your eye in that spot and have this nice kind of retreat right by the house. Maybe design is making the most of what you've got. At the top, you'll see a before picture, and at the bottom, an after. So before, they had some pretty nice turf, I guess, but it was just a slope. There wasn't a lot of use for this space. And so when Drake and them came in, they wanted to make this an area they could utilize, outdoor grilling, entertaining, a retaining wall here so that they could have some plant material, maybe prevent some erosion. And so all of this goes into making this more of a usable area and making the most of what they have. Another kind of example of making the most of what you got is this backyard. Another slope that may not have really had a purpose. They didn't really know how to utilize this space. And so they came in and put in this beautiful water feature and added this walkway, this kind of informal pathway that curved along into the landscape and made it so that it felt, it matched. It went along with that kind of rustic, natural feel that they were going for. And it provided functionality to the space. It gave them a way to move through the landscape, walk down this path. They could still get up to the swing set for the kids, but they also had a nice water feature. Maybe if they were entertaining outside, you could hear the sound of that water feature moving through. And it all kept in the theme of what they wanted for the landscape. Maybe it's fixing issues like drainage or erosion. Now, this is a commercial site. This is not your backyard. Now, I guess it could be if you are really into bioretention. But this is a good example of utilizing plant materials for issues like stormwater runoff, and where you can retain that water and make it stay on site instead of running off and creating erosion problems. And so here you'll see the bioretention at installation, and then 18 months later, look how much it's filled in. And you could do this on a smaller scale in your own landscape. We have things like rain gardens that we can utilize in our landscapes that will help when, let's say, you've got a lot of water coming off your roof and your downspout is pouring into your landscape and it's running off, or creating areas where the water just sits. Design can help, maybe a dry creek bed, which is, rock that you can utilize and move that water through your landscape, or something like a rain garden that'll help filter that water and help it infiltrate into our soils instead of running off. So when we get into design, there are several principles we want to think about. And the first ones are going to be our practical principles. And these are the ones that, above all, we need to make sure that we can maintain our landscape, that it is maintenance is something that we can do, that it's functional. If it's not functional, if you're not going to use it, then why would we design it that way? We want to make sure that it meets all of your needs. And that it's sustainable, that it's going to sustain itself over time. So with functionality, some of the questions we ask ourselves is, who's going to use the space? Is it you? Maybe you've got kids, grandkids, maybe you entertain a lot. Who's going to use the space? And then how are they going to use it? So let's say you're like this gentleman who what he wanted in this was he wanted a space to entertain. He didn't have kids or grandkids over very often. If he did, they would probably have a lot of fun playing in that water feature. But he really wanted a space to entertain. He wanted to create rooms within his landscape. And so the way he did that was creating pathways and spaces where people could sit and rest and relax and converse. So he's got that. He's got the water feature running in the background, which creates a nice calming environment. And so this may not be for everyone. This may not be a functional landscape for you, but for him, it met the needs of what he wanted with his design. And you'll notice there's not a whole lot of plant material. There's some wooded areas around him. He's strategically placed some plant materials along the water feature, but for the most part, it's not a whole lot of plants. It's a whole lot of moving around space and entertaining space. So just because we say landscape design doesn't mean you have to fill it full of plants. You just got to make sure it works for what you want. And you also need to think about, how are you going to move through that landscape? One of the things to think about is, the pathways you're going to take. Is that a turf pathway? Well, if it is, you're going to cause a lot of compaction with that turf. So maybe having a pathway like in the previous picture, where we had stone pathways you could walk through instead of further damaging and compacting your soil. Thinking of how, curving pathways or straight ways to get to certain features of your landscape, certain entertaining spaces, doors, maintenance areas. Think of how you're going to move through that landscape. And thinking about maintenance, in our design class, the first thing we talked about was maintenance. Who's going to maintain it, and how are they going to maintain it? Are you okay with a low maintenance landscape, or are you okay with a high maintenance landscape? You got to think about that before. My parents had someone design their landscape a while back, and Drake can tell you several Mother's Day gifts were us coming out there and digging up plants and pulling out things because they had stuffed it so full. The designer had gone for that instant impact. So the first 5 years, it was gorgeous. It was full of plants. It had looked nice. But after that 5-year mark, it started getting crowded. And 10 years down the road, it was overwhelming. The plant material was growing on top of each other. You couldn't see the windows of the house. It was just a maintenance nightmare. And so we spent time trying to dig out and clean out and make sure that it was more maintainable. Another thing that they did was they put Eleagnus, if you're not familiar with it, I call it ugly Agnes, but it is a shrub that can grow, 2-3 feet a year at least. And so they put it all around the air conditioning unit. So in order to get to the air conditioning unit, my father now has to take a chainsaw and whack it back every year. And he stands on the ladder with his saw, and it is very unsafe. OSHA would not approve. But that was not well thought out. Initially, when those plants were small, it was easy to get to the air conditioning unit. Now it's not. So thinking about those things ahead of time, who's going to do the work and how are you going to do it? This is also a time to think about budget. And all throughout the process, we need to be considering budget. Some of us are better with budgets than others. And so we need to be thinking about how much do I want to put into this landscape, at least at this point in time. And then with the last of the practical principles is sustainability. And, Lucas, if you haven't watched the recording or you didn't attend the last talk, he talked about right plant, right place. And that's just, we say it all the time, but it's one of the best principles and practices to have in your landscape is choosing the correct plant for whatever spot it's in. Stressed plants are more maintenance. Stressed plants require more fertilizer input or water input or disease pesticide input because you're trying to control disease because they're not happy where they are, or heaven forbid they die and you have to replace them. And heaven forbid you replace them with the same thing again and you see the problems happen again. So when you're looking at plant material, which should be towards the end of your design, because we got to look at the site first and see what does well, what will do well there. But when you're picking out plant material, you make sure it does well in that spot. Is it full sun? Is it shade? What are the water issues? Am I going to have to supplement with irrigation? So we need to kind of think through those things before we pick plant material. And then with landscape inputs, there's time, money, tools, blood, sweat, tears, especially the blood and sweat, and sometimes the tears. But thinking of all that you're going to input into that landscape and, is it worth your time? Is it worth your money? What landscape is going to meet those needs? Do you have the tools required to maintain it? And then, of course, plants, we got to think of those last. And all throughout this, if y'all got questions, just put them in the chat box. I didn't tell that earlier, but we'll be happy to answer all of your questions at the end of this. Next are our aesthetic principles. So we talked about our practical principles, which I'm a pretty practical person for the most part. And so I like to think of those first, because if it's not functional, if I'm not gonna be able to maintain it, the rest doesn't really matter. But when we start putting pen to paper or pencil to paper, or you get on the computer and you're doing your design, there are certain aesthetic principles that are important to consider. Probably the number one principle, and it's kind of the overriding principle, is unity. We want to make sure that our landscape feels unified, that it doesn't feel disconnected. It is our overriding principle. And one of the ways we can achieve unity is through repetition and repeating certain elements in your landscape, whether it's color. A way you can do that is putting a certain color throughout your landscape, not just one color here, one color there. It can look kind of disjointed. My favorite flower color is purple. And so anytime we try to do something in our landscape, and I'm sure Drake gets sick of it because he's the creative one and he can have all these cool ideas. But every time I'm like, I want monochromatic. I want all purple landscape because I love the purple flowers. And so a way that I could unify that is at the front, have some purple, and then around the side, have a little purple here or there. And it can connect and feel like it is unified. Maybe it's through lines, maybe bed lines. You can have curving bed lines, straight bed lines, all different kinds of bed lines, but making sure that they match and that theme is repeated throughout the landscape will help it feel connected and like it's one design, like it was well thought out. Maybe it's through hardscape materials. I have some pictures in a little bit, and actually you saw a picture when I was showing some of those focal points of repeated elements of hardscapes so that they match, so that it looks intentional, not like one part was done a long time ago and then they ran out of material and put something else in and it doesn't feel like it's connected. But repeating certain hardscape elements can help bring that unity into your landscape. Maybe it's using similar backgrounds and foregrounds, establishing those. And I just realized I misspelled connections. Ignore that, everyone. But having that connection between your plants, having certain plants repeated throughout the landscape. Maybe it's you really are into, like in this one, he really likes fault cypress. And so he's got those mixed throughout his landscape. Or maybe you really like azaleas. And so you've got a little azalea here, azalea there. But having that similar plant material repeated throughout your design will help it feel connected. And then having something like a focal point, like I showed in the focal point picture with that water feature, it establishes dominance. It brings your eye to a certain spot. Your eye's not moving willy-nilly all over the landscape trying to find a spot to rest. It is told where to rest, and that makes that design feel like it's unified, like it was intentional. So this is a good example. This is a different angle of that picture of the water feature, but this is a good example of unity. And so there are a lot of elements that are repeated here. One of the first things I see, and I would normally in a class be like, what do you see first? But one of the first things I see here is the shape. The round circular shape is repeated throughout, whether it's the grass around that water feature. The water feature itself has a round base. The arbor to the back has a rounded arch that you can walk under. The hardscape materials around there, it's all in a circular pattern. And so repeating that circular element as many times as was done in this design makes it feel intentional, makes it feel unified. There are also repeated plant elements. I mean, you can see that here. This is an evergreen landscape. This is what they wanted. They wanted something evergreen. So there are pops of color in here. There's some daylilies here. There's a mix of perennials, and a different season you would see them blooming. So there will be pops of color, but all throughout the year there's green. There's something green, whether it's a light green, a dark green, medium green. They've repeated that evergreen color palette so that it feels unified. And then they've got a lot of varying textures, so it's not too boring. Sometimes people, when they think of unity, they think, oh, that's boring. I've got the same thing over and over again. But there's an art to it. There's a way to do it that it's not boring. And I think this is a well done example of that. The next principle we talk about simplicity and variety. So that simplicity and the variety create a harmony in the landscape, and they need to work together. You need both of these in a design. It can't be too simple because it'll get monotonous and boring, but there can't be too much variety. As much as we love plants, it can sometimes seem a bit chaotic if there's just too much going on. Your eye's not going to know where to go. And of course, repetition, just like with unity, can enhance that. So having those repeated elements. So simplicity, this one is not the best one. I've got to find a better example of simplicity than this one, because this is not bad, but it is very simple. And if this is all you wanted in the landscape, that's great. There's a little variety in there, but for the most part, they've chosen a few evergreen plants for the front of the landscape. They've got a couple of trees, and that's it. Now, let's say they didn't have the trees. Maybe they just had one type of plant on the front. This might come across as a little bit boring, maybe a little too simple. But I do appreciate that they mulched around those trees in the landscape instead of just plopping those trees in the turf, which is a big no-no. Variety. This is actually intended to be this way because this is a pollinator garden. But just imagine there was a very formal house and a very formal design, and then we had this. It just looked like an explosion of plants. This may be too much for someone. This may be too much texture, too many different types of texture and color and mix of plant materials. And there's not really a sense of unity necessarily in this shot and frame of this. So this is a good example of having a lot of variety. But here's a pretty good example of mixing the two. This isn't boring. You've got some annuals, you've got perennials, you've got some foundation plants, evergreen trees, you've got low, medium, high. And so this adds that variety, but it's not too much. It's not too crazy that your eye is taken away from the focal point, which is the house, which is the home. And with this design, the people that own the house, the property owners, didn't want a lot of plant material. And so they did a great job of not putting too much plant material, but taking commonly used hardy good plants and mixing them in a way that added that variety, that interest to the landscape. The next principle is proportion or scale. And this is just how things relate respective to size. So large and small elements in the landscape are fine, but they need something in the middle to bring them together. You know, when you've got just turf and then trees, there's a gap there and the eye tends to go right through it. And so having something in the middle to break that up. Or maybe it's that you've got a giant plant and a tiny landscape and it is dominating, it's overwhelming. With proportion, we always want to bring things down to a human scale. We want to make people feel welcome. They're not intimidated by the landscape. It's a good example is this picture here, which we got from Google Earth. And so you can see how these trees at one time when they were first planted and when they were younger in life were not so dominating and overwhelming in the landscape. They probably fit proportionately. But as they matured and as they got larger, they overwhelmed the landscape. You can't, especially if you were standing at the road, you couldn't really see the house. You know, and that's not really the intention of a design. It's not to block the house, it's to enhance the landscape. And so having these giant trees in the smaller plot are going to make that feel unproportional. It's going to feel out of proportion. And we see this all the time. We're moving more towards smaller trees in the landscape because we do have smaller landscapes a lot of times now. Now, if you've got a really big yard and you need to fill up space, well, of course you can put a big tree, but you need to make sure that it is proportionate to the home and the landscape that you have. The next principle is balance. And so balance is the visual weight. So how is that distribution of visual weight? And we talk about this in the form of asymmetry and symmetry. A symmetrical landscape, one that's the same on either side, it's mirror image, usually lends itself to a more formal feel, more static, classical. A lot of times I like to think of English knot gardens and Versailles, and they're very symmetrical and well planned out and designed, and that fits that formality that they are going for. Asymmetry, on the other hand, has a more casual feel. It's going to give a lot of movement, and it's achieved by using similar ideas, but different materials on either side. It's still an equal visual weight distribution. So you still don't feel out of balance. It's just you're not mirror imaging the same thing on either side. A couple of examples. This is a great example of symmetry. It's also a great example of a focal point because my eye goes right between there to that beautiful fireplace. And this is an entertaining area. And it's a very symmetrical building. So a lot of times your house and your building can lend itself to one design or another. So this is a very symmetrical structure. And so a very symmetrical design works well with that. And so you can see, I mean, it is a mirror image on one side and the other. You've got the same plant materials repeated. And that creates that equal distribution of visual weight while mirroring that plant material on either side. Some downfalls of symmetry, if we lost one plant on one side or the other, it may feel out of balance. You know, it's going to be a lot more easily, visually, you can see that a lot more easily if that happens in a symmetrical landscape versus an asymmetrical landscape. But having a symmetrical structure or a symmetrical house can make a symmetrical landscape design work really well. And this is a good example of asymmetry. This house is definitely not symmetrical. It is really neat and interesting and has a lot of different peaks and heights, and you know, it's not symmetrical. And so yes, there is a symmetrical path, but we're leading our eye to that front door, right? That's managing the viewer's eye. But if you look on either side of the door, you'll notice it doesn't feel out of balance. You know, it doesn't feel like we're too top heavy on one side or the other, but it's not the same thing. We have different repeated elements. On the right, we have more visually tall plants that we can see, but maybe fewer medium and smaller plants. And on the left side, we've got some medium, small, a few tall plants, but we've balanced that without having to repeat the same elements on either side, and it still feels like it goes. And then the last principle of design is sequence or rhythm. And this is kind of seen a lot of times as a supporting element, but sequence really helps move you through the landscape. It creates interest and action. And what sequence is you're gently graduating, maybe it's plant size, color, texture, and it makes that viewer feel like they have a composition of the landscape. They can make sense of what's going on. It helps the eye move from one area of interest to another. So in this picture, you can see we've got some low plants, we've got some medium plants, we've got taller plants. So it's not just a drastic change from one to the other. We have that gradual movement. Or maybe it's that we've got plants of different textures. We've got fine textures to medium to coarse texture, and that moves our eye. It's just a way to move someone, whether it's visually or physically, through a landscape by creating that nice rhythm instead of it feeling very jarring. So those are some of the principles of design. And now I'm going to turn it over to Drake, and he's going to talk through the actual design process, which is something he does on a daily basis.
You'll have to forgive me. Taylor is a much better orator than I am, and speaks a little bit better. So the first stage of the design process typically involves the creation of a base map. And this is a really important step to get right and correct, because the rest of your design hinges on it. So the one thing, there's multiple things, but the main thing you want to make sure that you address in a base map is how the site looks today. That includes your property lines, your existing house, existing trees, hardscapes, any utilities you have, any setbacks or easements. A lot of times in our neighborhoods, we have drainage easements, we have no build setbacks, we have TVA lines. There's so many things that come through that dictate what we can and can't do in regards to plants and hardscape. An important piece of that is trying to be as accurate as possible. So this is one that I actually went on site and measured. It was a combination of photographs and me measuring. It took a long time, but we were also designing the whole site. Sometimes you don't need that. A lot of times we're just doing the front of our bed, or maybe we're just doing immediately around the house. So we don't need as an intense of a base map as others. If you have a survey, it makes the job a whole lot easier. And a lot of times when you've closed on your house, you have a survey that's included in your closing documents. Knowing where the scales are, what scale it is, and where north is always a main thing to know, especially when you're thinking about lighting and how it moves across the landscape. So base map, super important. Everything else kind of hinges on it. So if something is inaccurate or kind of messed up in the base map, it kind of throws off the whole process. This is the one piece that most people I find have the hardest time figuring out, is how to make a base map. And so I tell people to start out small and easy, and get you some graph paper and a pencil, and use those little squares as 1 foot or 2 foot or 3 foot, and get out there and measure.
Yeah, I always like to give graph paper out when I'm teaching this class and let people draw their house out. And it makes for a nice visual, and remembering where all your hardscapes are and your utilities and things like that. Where's your air conditioning unit, so you can design around it.
The next part is site analysis. And basically this just means we're observing different unique characteristics of each site. This phase is super important because this is what a lot of times makes landscapes unique, because how we apply those design principles Taylor talked about to each site is often dictated by each site and their unique features of that site. These include things like sun versus shade, microclimates, areas that the sun moves across the landscape, wind exposure, protected areas for more sensitive plants. This is views, both for privacy and for creating awesome, unique, fun views that you want to keep and manage. This includes drainage, which, like Taylor talked about, is a big issue in a lot of people's. You don't want to put a high, dry, loving plant in an area that stays constantly wet. And then area of interest that you want to become focal points. Maybe there's a spot in your landscape that feels amazing for morning coffee, want to create a sitting space there so that you can go out there and have your morning coffee because you know how the sun hits it with the dappled shade, all these things kind of aligning to make this beautiful moment. Those are things to put on a site analysis so that when you're going through looking at conceptual design, you can incorporate those.
You'd put this on top of your base map, right?
Yes, use your base map and then start drawing on top of it some of the site analysis features. And then that often leads to conceptual design. And so conceptual design is really about focusing on big ideas. We don't want to get too much into the details of like how thick our concrete or necessarily like how much square footage of X, Y, Z. We really want to look at the big overarching ideas that we want to incorporate into the design. We want to make a list of our wants and needs. What programming we want for the site. Do we want a patio? Do we want a pool? Do we want just landscape? Do we want a water feature or garden, a pollinator garden? Those are things to write down and start figuring out based on our site analysis where those places make sense to highlight. And one thing I always tell people is do not just do one. You need to do at least 3 or 4 because a lot of times we kind of get married to the idea of our first design and we think it's the best one. But a lot of times if you do 2 or 3, you start looking at the site a little differently. And usually what happens is your final design ends up as a combination of 2 or 3 of them and really kind of brings out the best in all of them. This is also a stage where you can get either client feedback or if you're helping a friend where they can look at it and say, I don't know how I really feel about that. I don't know that I would highlight X, Y, Z, or I would do this or that. And so it allows you to kind of incorporate those ideas without having invested too much time in plant quantities and exactly what plants. We just know we want maybe an evergreen hedge here. We want a flowering tree here. This is a nice spot for my garden. And sometimes this can be your final design. This can be what you take and build off of, especially if you're doing it yourself. You may just need to get your ideas out there and take this, or you have a friend that's doing it. You can just kind of walk through what you want. As plant people, a lot of times we like to go buy plants and then we can kind of like shuffle them in the landscape to get them how we look. And that's fine. That's great. So this leaves you that creativity, that space to be able to do that.
And I will say this is my favorite part of design. When I went through design class, I have a very hard time making decisions. Being decisive is not something I'm very good at. And so having the flexibility of just doing a bubble. And if you look at this picture, this is Drake's conceptual design he did. And this is a very fancy one. Mine are usually just ugly bubbles that I've done over the top of my base map and my site analysis. And I've bubbled, this is a good spot for vegetable garden. And this is where I want my flower beds. And at some point, you start to really think through, will that work here, and visualize it. I'm a very visual person. So doing that conceptual design and that bubbling, that's my favorite part. And I usually don't even make it to the final design. I'm like, time to go buy some plants.
And then you get to your final design stage. And this is usually the step that you need if you are trying to price it out, or maybe you have a longer term vision that you want to work towards over the course of multiple years. This is where we specify our plants and materials, and not just we want hardscape, but we want pavers, or we want stamped concrete, or we want stone for this much, and then it transitions to concrete. This is where we add our custom detailing. If there's something that's unique and different that we want to incorporate into our layout, this is the area where we kind of spell it out. And this is this place where you can do your bidding and estimating. A lot of times what happens is we get to this stage, we get our quantities and we're like, wow, that was way high. So then we're back to our conceptual design and back to final design. What's important about the final design is being specific. This plan should be able to stand on its own. You should be able to hand this to a contractor or a friend that knows how to read plans, and they should be able to build it exactly how you imagined it in your mind. So we want all of our quantities to be correct. We want the type, not just the plant, but the cultivars. That is hugely important, especially when you start talking about plants that the cultivars mean different sizes and different light needs. Those are all kind of important.
You can't just say tulip tree because there's a lot of different types of tulip trees out there.
And this is also an area where we can put our planting instructions. Now, this is actually, I would consider probably more of a conceptual design, a little bit more refined conceptual design. And we actually built the whole piece off of just this. And this doesn't have some of those more direct quantities, but you could see with this one, we can get a pretty good idea of how many green giant arborvitaes, how many emerald green arborvitaes. We can still get those quantities, but maybe not to the level that you're used to seeing as a final design. Some of the details, this was that one where we created that wall. And this is one where we wanted to look at, okay, they wanted some evergreens because they were about to build a new neighborhood behind them. And so they wanted some privacy, but they also wanted to create enough space out from their house that they could enjoy a flat area. Their kids could go play and run and throw the football, and everything wasn't just on a slope. So we went back and forth and did a lot of studying of how much space is too much and how tall the wall before we kind of settled on that. And this is the detail that we ended up with. Most people, this is what they think of as a final design. This is in CAD, so it's super precise. It's got different plant symbols, and all of the species and variety are written on this plan. And this is one that anybody could pick up and know exactly what they're going to get. This is the circular area we looked at before, and this is that entry.
Yeah, that's where that water feature is.
So, this is the final piece that we used for our final design. And this had all our quantities. Also attached to the sheet, we had planting details. When I was working at this company, it was a design build. So this was for our guys in the field. And we did a lot of in the field analysis with that. I get this question a lot, so we wanted to go ahead and put it in there as useful resources for doing design. Google Earth is a great resource. You can measure in Google Earth. You can see topo a lot of times. You can get an aerial view of your map. Another helpful thing is the GIS maps. Most counties or your city has a GIS map or a tax map that shows your parcel, usually has your easements. If you live in a neighborhood, a lot of times you have plats that are recorded that have a lot of your easements and stuff on there. One thing I always tell people, research designers you like. Look at landscapes that you really enjoy, you really think they do a great job, and look at what they're doing, how they're using plants, and that can help inform you when you're thinking about your own yard or if you're designing for someone else. UT Hort.
Yeah, we have a great website, uthort.com. You've probably been there before or heard about it, but if you've not, it's got our publications, all of our horticulture publications are housed there. And you can go to that website and they have them by category. And so you can go, if you're looking for perennials for Tennessee landscapes, there is a publication for that. And it lists all the perennials we recommend for Tennessee. There's one for annuals. There's one for screen. So if you're really looking to screen a view or block in a view, we have a great publication on good screen plants. Stop planting Leland cypress, people. It's not a good plant. We have better options, and they're on that publication. We also have great ones on rain gardens and on landscape design. There's a publication on landscape design in there. So if you go to that uthort.com, there's a lot of great information you can use. And then we're both book nerds. And so I have several design books, and I know Drake does as well. We couldn't bring them all here to show y'all. But if you want to get some good recommendations, we would be happy to give y'all some if you reach out to us for sure. And then, of course, your local extension agent. They are the great place to start if you've got questions about your landscape, whether it's plant material, identification, drainage, turf. That's your local extension office, and your county extension agent is a great place to start.
Hey, Taylor.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat, and it's talking about a design software. Is there a good design software out there for beginners? Drake mentioned CAD a minute ago, and that's a little overwhelming. I wouldn't recommend that for beginners, but is there one out there for beginners or something?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I also get that question a lot. And it's difficult because most of the programs that make it really easy are also really expensive and probably not practical if you're not kind of in commercial, in that commercial realm. I've seen a lot of people will use, I I say
PowerPoint?
PowerPoint.
A lot of people will use PowerPoint. They'll take a picture of their landscape and put it in PowerPoint. And yes, it is not as exact as CAD, but it really helps you get a good visual. You can put in shapes of plants or actual pictures of plants and superimpose them in that PowerPoint. And it's free. It's easy to use. And if you already know how to use PowerPoint, it makes it a lot easier. But I get asked that question every single time I do this talk. And by the time I've done the talk, whatever the happening software that was out there is no longer available. So it really just, you got to do a little research. There aren't any off the top of my head that I can think of that are really great for beginners. Now, I will say I went and ran and got my phone. There is an app called iScape, and it is a free app to an extent. As all apps are, there's always in-app purchases, but this is a fun one. And I wish I could show you, but if you download it, you can kind of see. And what you do is, so we can see if y'all can see. So this is the iScape app. I don't want it to track me, but so one thing you do is you can take a picture and pull it up. And there's a picture I took on a snowy day last year, and I can add plants to this. So I can add a tree. And so if you look at this, I can add a tree and I can move it around on this landscape. Well, it wants me to rate the app. There we go. I can move it around on here and put it where I want it and make it bigger, smaller. And that's a maple tree. Or let's say I want to do some shrubs. I can add a flowering shrub in here and put it to size. So it actually helps you get, I can see that, actually helps you get a pretty good visual if you just take a picture. And that's called iScape. There are free parts of this app, but yes, there are options for you to buy more. I'm just cheap and I never buy apps.
Another good tool is you can do Google Earth or Google Maps on your phone. You take a screenshot, and then in your you can mark up pictures. So you can like draw circles and stuff over that screenshot you've taken. It's hard to get an accurate scale, but it would be a really good way to kind of figure out some site analysis and to get basic like proportion and shape and how things are in relation to each other in your landscape.
Are there any questions? I know we didn't get into specific plants, and it's hard because you only have so long to talk, and there's so many great plants for Tennessee landscapes, and it all really depends on your site. So if you have specific plant questions, of course, there's those resources I mentioned, and your local extension agent. You can always reach out to me. I'm happy to look at pictures, give recommendations. We all have our favorite plants, and we all have plants we don't like. And so not everybody's the same. There are certain plants like, unfortunately, Nandina, I'm sorry, it's just not my favorite plant. If you love it, that is totally you go. But there are certain plants that we all have an affinity for. I love shade plants, but our landscape has not a lick of shade on it. So sometimes we have to compromise when we're doing right plant, right place.
Tyler, we appreciate you and Drake taking the time out of your busy schedule and coming our way with this information. It was a lot of good information. I'm just disappointed we didn't get to see the 4-year-old run into the screen.
Well, we've got him tucked away over here eating. So he yelled just a second ago, and I went to go see what he needed. But he's over here hanging out. So he said I'd be a little shy. So
again, and we appreciate everybody joining in. Don't forget about we will have our last Ag Talk Tuesday, and it will be on March the 21st, and we have Dr. Natalie Bumgarter with us that night. So be on the lookout for the reminders, and we don't have any other questions.